A narrative of the life and adventures of Venture, a native of Africa, but resident above 60 years in the United States of America, related by himself.
I was employed in cutting the aforementioned quantity of wood. I never was at the expense of sixpence worth of spirits. Being after this labor 40 years of age, I worked at various places, and in particular on Ram Island, where I purchased Solomon and Cuff, two sons of mine, for $400 each.
I will be here remembered how much money I earned by cutting wood in 4 years.
Besides this, I had considerable money, amounting in all to near 300 pounds. When I had purchased my two sons, I then left no more than 100 pounds.
After this, I purchased a Negro man for no reason than to oblige him, and gave for him 50 pounds. But in a short time after he run away from me, and I thereby lost all that I gave for him, except 20 pounds which he paid me previous to his absconding.
The rest of my money I laid out in land, in addition to a farm which I owed before, and a dwelling house thereon. 44 years had then completed the revolution since my entrance into this existence of servitude and misfortune.
Solomon, my eldest son, being then in his 17th year, and all my hope and dependence for help, I hired him out to one Charles Church of Rhode Island for 1 year on confederation of his giving him 12 pounds and the opportunity of acquiring some learning.
In the courage of the year, Church fitted out a vessel for a whaling voyage, and being in want of hands to man her, he induced my son to go, with the promise of giving him on his return a pair of silver buckles, besides his wages.
As soon as I heard of his going to sea, I immediately set out to go and prevent it if possible. But on my arrival at Church's, to my great grief, I could only see the vessel my son was in almost out of sight going to sea.
My son died of the scurvy in this voyage, and the Church has never yet paid me in the least of his wages. And my son, besides the loss of his life, I lost equal to 75 pounds.
My other son, being but a youth, still lived with me. About this time, I chartered a sloop of about 30 tons burden and hired men to assist me in navigating her.
I employed her mostly in the wood trade to Rhode Island and made clear of all expenses above $100 with her in the better than 1 year. I had then become something for-handed, and being in my 44th year, I purchased my wife, Meg, and thereby prevented having another child to buy. As she was then pregnant, I gave 40 pounds for her.
During my residence at Long Island, I raised 1 year with another, 10 cartloads of watermelons, and lost a great many every year besides by the thievishness of the sailors. What I made by the watermelons I sold there amounted to nearly $500. Various other methods I pursued in order to enable me to redeem my family.
In the nighttime, I fished with set nets and pots for eels and lobsters, and shortly after went a whaling voyage in the service of Colonel Smith. After being out 7 months, the vessel returned, laden with 400 barrels of oil. About this time, I become possessed of other dwelling house, and my temporal affairs were in a pretty prosperous condition.
This, and my industry, was what alone saved me from being expelled that part of the island in which I refused, as an act was passed by the select men of the place that all Negroes residing there should be expelled.
Next after my wife, I purchased a Negro man for $400, but he has an inclination to return to his old master. I therefore let him go. Shortly after, I purchased another Negro man for 25 pounds, whom I parted with shortly after.
Being about 46 years old, I bought my oldest child, Hannah, of Ray Mumford, for 44 pounds, and she still resided with him. I had already redeemed from slavery myself, my wife, and 3 children, besides 3 Negro men.
About the 47th year of my life, I differed all my property at Long Island, and came from thence into East Haddam.
I hired myself out at first to Timothy Chapman for 5 weeks, the earnings of which I put up carefully by me.
After this, I wrought for Abel Bigham about 6 weeks, and then I put my money together and purchased the said Bigham 10 acres of land, lying at Haddam Neck, where I now reside.
On this land, I labored with great diligence for 2 years, and shortly after purchased 6 acres more of land contiguous to my other. 1 year from that time, I purchased 70 acres more of the game man, and paid for it mostly with the produce of my other land.
Soon after, I bought this last of land. I get up a comfortable dwelling house on my farm, and build it from the produce thereof.
Shortly after, I had much trouble and expense with my daughter Hannah, whose name has before been mentioned in this account. She was married soon after I redeemed her to one Isaac, a free Negro man, and shortly after her marriage fell sick of a mortal defeat. Her husband, a dissolute and abandoned wretch, paid but little attention to her in her illness.
I therefore thought it best to bring her to my house and nurse her there. I procured her all the aid morals could afford, but nothing withstanding this fell a prey to her defeat, after a lingering and painful endurance of it.
The physician's bill for attending her during her illness amounted to 40 pounds. Having reached my 54th year, I purchased two Negro men, one named William Jacklin and the other Mingo.
Mingo lived with me 1 year, and having received his wages, run in debt to me $8, for which he gave me his note. Presently, after he tried to run away from me without troubling himself to pay up his note, I procured a warrant, took him, and requested him to go to Justice Stoops of his county court, but he refusing, I took him on my shoulders and carried him there, distant about 2 miles, the justice asking me if I had my prisoner's note with me. On replying that I had not, he told me I must return with him and get it.
Accordingly, I carried Mingo back on my shoulders, but before we arrived at my dwelling, he complained of being hurt and asked me if this was not a hard way of treating our fellow creatures. I answered him that it would be hard thus to treat our honest fellow creatures. He then told me that if I would let him off my shoulders, he had a pair of silver shoe buckles and a shirt and a pocket handkerchief, which he would turn out to me.
I agreed and let him return home with me on foot, but the very following night, he flipped from me, stole my horse, and has never paid me his note. The other Negro man, Jacklin, being a comb maker by trade, he requested me to get him up and promised to reward me with all his labor. Accordingly, I bought him a set of tools for making combs and procured him stock. He worked in my house for about 1 year and then run away from me with all his combs and owed me for all his board.
About 12 years ago, I hired a whaleboat and 4 black men and proceeded to Long Island after a load of round clams. Having arrived there, I first purchased of James Webb, son of Orange Webb, 660 clams, and afterwards, with the help of my men, finished loading the boat.
The same evening, however, this Webb stole my boat and went in her to Connecticut River and folded her cargo for his own benefit. I thereupon pursued him, and at length, after an additional expense of 9 crowns, recovered the boat. But for the proceeds of her cargo, I never could obtain any compensation.
4 years after, I met with another loss, far superior to this in value, and I think by no less wicked means. Being going to New London with the grandchild, I took passage in an Indian's boat and went there with him.
On our return, the Indian took on board 2 hogsheads of molasses, one of which belonged to Captain Elijah Hart of Saybrook, to be delivered on his wharf. When he arrived there, and while I was gone, at the request of the Indian, to inform Captain Hart of his arrival, and received the freight for him. 1 hogshead of the molasses had been lost overboard by the people in attempting to land in on the wharf.
Although I was absent at the time and had no concern whatever in the business, as was known to a number of respectable witnesses, I was nevertheless prosecuted by this conscientious gentleman, the Indian not being able to pay for it, and obliged to pay upwards of 10 pounds lawful money with all the costs of court.
I applied to several gentlemen for counsel in this affair, and they advised me, as my adversary was rich, and threatened to carry the matter from court to court till it would cost me more than first damages would be, to pay the fund and submit to the injury, which I accordingly did, and he was often since insultingly taunted me with my unmerited misfortune.
Such a proceeding as this, committed on a defenseless stranger, almost worn out in the hard service of the world, without any foundation in reason or justice, whatever it may be called in a Christian land, would in my native country have been branded as a crime equal to highway robbery. But Captain Hart was a white gentleman, and I a poor African. Therefore, it was all right, and good enough for the black dog.
I am now 69 years old, the one straight and tall, measuring without shoes 6 feet 1 inch and a half, and every way well proportioned. I'm now bowed down with age and hardship.
My strength, which was once equal, if not superior, to any man whom I have ever seen, is not enfeebled, so that life is a burden, and it is with fatigue that I can walk a couple of miles, stooping over my staff. Other griefs are still behind, on account of which some aged people, at least, will pity me.
My eyesight has gradually failed, till I'm almost blind, and whenever I go aboard, one of my grandchildren must direct my way. Besides, for many years I had been such pain and trouble with an ulcer on one of my legs. But amidst all my griefs and pains, I had many consultations. Meg, the wife of my youth, is still alive.
My freedom is a privilege which nothing else can equal. Notwithstanding all the losses I have suffered by fire, by the injustice of knaves, by the cruelty and oppression of false-hearted fiends, and the perfidy of my own countrymen whom I have assisted and redeemed from bondage, I am now possessed of more than 100 acres of land and 3 habitable dwelling houses.
It gives me joy to think that I have, and that I deserve, so good a character, especially for truth and integrity. While I am now looking to the grave as my home, my joy for this world will be full. If my children, Cuss, for whom I paid $200 when a boy, and Solomon, who was born soon after I purchased his mother, if Cuss and Solomon,
Oh, that they had walked in the way of their father, but a father's lips are closed in silence and in grief. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Venice.